Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BISG book talk with Sandra Matz today. And we are delighted to welcome you. Sandra is a pioneer in the field of computational social science and an associate professor at the Columbia Business School in New York. And as a computational social scientist, she studies human behavior and preferences using a combination of big data analytics and traditional experimental methods. Her research aims to understand how psychological characteristics influence real-world outcomes in a number of business-related domains, from financial well-being to consumer satisfaction to team performance, with the goal of helping businesses and individuals to make better choices. She was also named one of the Data IQ's 100 most influential people in data-driven marketing and was recognized as one of the top 30 thinkers under 30 by the Pacific Standard magazine. And her work has been published in top-tier journals such as Psychological Science and the American Psychologist, and has attracted worldwide media attention. Now we are delighted to hear more about her recently published book, Mindmasters, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior. And I hand it over to you, Sandra. Looking forward to your book talk.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Nadia. And it's really nice to be here with you. I know that for most of you, it's probably going to be the lunch break. So I appreciate you making the time. And I should say, so my background is actually in psychology and computer science, and now I'm in a business school. So I really live in these different worlds of like messy, real world human behavior, emotions and desires. And then also, if you want, almost like paradoxically, this world of like cold math and equations and algorithms. And I think for a long time, these worlds have kind of been really quite segregated and separated. But as I'm sure many of you are aware, over the last 15, 20 years, they've actually merged in the sense that we kind of now use the tools that computer science has to offer. So again, like computers, like AI, machine learning, to understand human behavior. And in a way, that's at the heart of a lot of the work that I do. It's at the heart of the book Mindmasters that I wrote, and also, as you can imagine, at the heart of what I want to talk about today. The way that I've planned a session is that I'll kind of walk you briefly through some of the ideas in the book to give you a sense of here's what I care about. Here's some of examples that I give in the book that I think make this intersection of computer science and psychology really relatable. And then there's going to be a lot of time for Q&A. So you can either post these questions in the chat. I know that someone is managing them on the back end, but very excited to dive into this conversation after. So let me quickly pull up the slides so we can all start from a common ground. Okay, so essentially, I do want to start in a place it kind of has nothing to do with AI. This is Prugesheim, which is the village that I grew up in. It has like 500 people somewhere in the southwest corner of Germany. And my experience of growing up in this village was really that there was someone looking over my shoulder and observing my behavior pretty much at any given point in time, right? So the 499 other people living in Germany, they knew exactly what I was doing on the weekends. They knew who I was dating. They knew which music I was into, which car I was driving, what I wanted to do after high school. So they really had this like really intimate window into my life, into like my habits, my routines, and away my desires, fears, aspirations. And you can imagine that this is not where it stopped, right? If you live in a village, your village neighbors don't observe everything that you do just for the fun of observation. They were trying to, in a way, meddle and influence the choices that I make. So they were not just observing who I was dating, they were also trying to influence who I was dating. And I remember very clearly that for me, this actually meant two things. On the one hand, it was actually incredible, right? Because those people truly were trying to be there for me when I needed support, when I needed help. They understood what I wanted. So when I kind of figured out what I wanted to do after school, they were giving me advice. They were making connections. They were trying to support me in many different ways. So the fact that there is someone who understood, if you want, my psychology, was incredibly helpful. But then on the other hand, as you might also be able to imagine, it also oftentimes felt very manipulative in the sense that they were trying to pull strings behind my back in a way that I didn't really appreciate and certainly didn't feel like I had full control over. Now, I moved away from this village many, many years ago now. I now live in New York with my family, but what I would argue is that in a way, we all live in a digital village today. And that's because we all have what I call these digital neighbors. So it's no longer your physical carbon copy who observes you running to the bus, who observes you making friends with a kid next door, but all of these traces that we generate as we interact with technology, sometimes intentionally, right? So the same way that back in the village, maybe I put a bumper sticker on my car, maybe I dyed my hair a certain color, maybe I put up a poster in my room to signal to myself and to others how I wanted to be seen and the person that I was. We oftentimes do this in the context of social media, right? We talk about what matters to us, like what we've been doing today, like the last couple of weeks. So we kind of send these very, what psychologists would call explicit identity claims. But then there's also all of these other traces that we generate that we would call behavioral residue that we leave in a way without really thinking about it. So again, going back to the village, my neighbors observed me running to the bus more than once. They clearly figured out that when they came home to see my room, it wasn't the most organized place, right? Or like they observed me kind of when there was like a big gatherings, maybe I wasn't the one kind of in the middle talking to everybody. Was like probably sitting more on the sides, having a good time by myself. So in the digital world, there's all of these equivalents where you create data, even if you're not thinking about it. That could be anything from you swiping your credit card, you carrying your phone with you pretty much 24/7 that captures everything from the places that you visit with your GPS record. Also, they can then map that onto Google and see here's maybe the activities that you engaged and you were in a certain place. Well, that's a yoga studio. Maybe you went to a yoga class. They can also figure out who's meeting up, right? Because those are two phones showing up in the same location potentially multiple times. So there's all of these traces that we generate with facial recognition, Internet of Things, credit card swipes, Google searches, and so on, that we don't really intentionally put out there, but they can still be really intimate in telling the story of who you are, what you do, your habits, routines, and so on. And for me, so for the last, almost 15 years now, I've spent most of my time studying this phenomena that I call psychological targeting. And analogous to the village, it's this idea that we can take the data that you generate, we can use AI, machine learning, to translate it into something that's psychologically meaningful. So it's not just your GPS record, it's not just the words that you use on social media, but I can translate it into something like your personality, your values, your life satisfaction, like a mental health kind of status and profile. And then I can use these insights that I can glean about your psychology and potentially use them to influence your behavior. So again, the same way that my neighbors weren't just in the business of observing, but really influencing what I was doing, psychological targeting means trying to understand who's on the other side based on the data, and then potentially using it to influence the way that we think, feel, and behave. And for all of the computer nerds in this audience, it's a little bit like the permission that we give files on a computer, right? If you save a document, you can have a permission to just read the document or to write into that document. And I think about it in like similar terms, like what psychological targeting allows you to do is read from the mind. So trying to figure out based on your data what's going on inside your mind, but then also write into the mind and kind of more proactively saying, can I shape how you think and feel about the world and how you really show up in your day-to-day interactions. There's three broad parts in the book and also three parts that I want to go through today. One is like, how does it work, right? How do machines actually take your digital footprints, turn them into more psychologically meaningful constructs? Second one is the glaring so what question. If I can understand your personality, your mental health status, your values, what power does that give me potentially when it comes to influencing your behavior? And then the final part, which I think is really important, both as academics and also as people who then might go on to industry, to government, and really make these big decisions, not just for ourselves, but also for other people, like that what now? How do we navigate this world where there's incredible opportunities, right? Once I understand your psychology, your needs, I can actually help you become better versions of yourselves, accomplish the goals that you set for yourselves and that might otherwise be difficult to accomplish. But I can also obviously use it to manipulate you in a way that you don't necessarily appreciate you and you have any control over. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we actually amplify these positives while mitigating some of the negatives. So that's the journey that I have sketched out for us. So now to the question of how. So this is really the foundation. How do we take data, translate it into something that's meaningful on a psychological level? You can imagine that pretty much all of this is driven by machine learning, increasingly powered by AI. So these models that were not necessarily trained for a specific purpose, but they just understand how the world works because they've read the entire internet. And I'm not going to go into any of the details for how you implement this technically, but what I'm going to show you is a couple of examples that I think very nicely illustrate how what you do online, so the traces that you generate, directly map onto something that is much deeper and much more fundamental in terms of your psychology. So let me start here. This is really some of the earliest work that was done in this space on Facebook. So those are words in people's Facebook status updates. So again, it's like essentially you updating other people about what's happening in your daily life that are most strongly correlated or that are most strongly associated with being extroverted. So people who are outgoing, social, excited by the social world. And you can see this reflected in the word cloud, right? So people talk about parties, weekends, amazing. They're just having a blast out there with your friends. Now, contrast that to the word clouds or the words that are used by introverts. And you really see these two personas emerge, right? So the introverts, they talk about internet, reading, anime, manga. Those are all activities that you don't need other people for, right? You can happily sit at home, enjoy your own company, doing all of these things. You don't need the social stimulation that extroverts crave. Here's another one that I think has this really good face validity, kind of this really good, kind of makes sense when you look at it. It's a personality trait that is called agreeableness. It kind of distinguishes between people who are very caring, trusting, empathetic. They care a lot about their social relationships versus people who are more critical and competitive. And you see that the caring, the high agreeableness side has this warm glow to it, right? That people talk about blessed, excited, amazing, wonderful, and thank you. So there's like this general feeling of gratitude and gratefulness. A word of warning, the word cloud for people who are more critical and competitive looks very different. So it's essentially like a whole bunch of swear words. And what I should say is, first of all, we're not cherry picking. So we're not going into the data and say, hey, which words would make for a funny word cloud? And it also doesn't mean that if you're critical and competitive, so low in agreeableness, that you swear all the time. All it means in a probabilistic way that if you happen to feel comfortable swearing on social media, chances that you're also somewhat more critical and competitive actually go up, right? And this, I think, is a general lesson about how these machines work. It's always an educated guess on who's on the other side, right? In a way, it's like, what is the prototypical person who uses these words or those words? So on average, and I'm going to give you some numbers in a second, those models are actually pretty accurate at making predictions of who we are, but obviously they're also going to get it wrong. And in a way, that's important when we come to the second part of so what. I don't necessarily mind getting your personality wrong. And if I'm trying to sell you toothpaste, maybe I'm just going to sell you the wrong toothpaste. But there's certain instances where actually getting it wrong might have much more meaningful implications, right? If I get it wrong and I don't give you access to a loan, well, then that's actually something that we should be a lot more concerned about. So I'm going to circle back to this later on. But what I want you to kind of take away here is that, first of all, it oftentimes those relationships make a lot of sense, right? They have really good face validity, and they're all probabilistic in the way that they tell us something about the person behind the data. Now, having said that a lot of these relationships are obvious, there's also, and this is what I love about this research, it's also oftentimes we actually learn something about psychology and human behavior that we didn't know before. And that's just because machines can make sense of like these vast amounts of data, right? And really just observe, empirically speaking, looking at the real world, what are some of the patterns that we see? And this is one of my favorite examples, the use of first person pronouns. So I, me, myself, references to the self. I remember that I first heard about this research. It's by Jamie Pennebaker, who's one of the leading figures in the space of natural language processing in the context of psychology. And he was presenting this at a conference, and he asked all of the psychologists in the room, what do you think the use of first person pronouns is related to, right? If I talk more about myself, what could this indicate in terms of my psychology? And I remember all of us were sure that it was going to be narcissism, because if you talk about yourself, that probably makes you a narcissist. And turns out that that's not actually the case. What this is a sign of is actually emotional distress. So if you suffer from something like anxiety, depression, chances that you're also talking more about yourself are actually elevated. And I remember sitting there thinking like, I don't fully understand, until we kind of started chatting with a table, and we kind of all thought back to a time that we felt maybe like a little bit blue, a little bit down, a little bit depressed. And in a way, when we do feel down, we don't think about the world's biggest problems, right? You don't think about how do I solve climate change, how do I cure cancer when you're struggling with depression. What you think about is, why am I feeling so bad? How do I get better? Am I ever going to get better? And this inner monologue that we have with ourselves just creeps into the language that we use, such that we're much more likely to have these references to ourselves. So for me, this is like just one of these very interesting examples of there's something that was just born out of the data that we didn't know before, even a psychologist thinking about this stuff all the time. And now looking back, it's not only diagnostic of, yeah, maybe if we see these words popping up, maybe that increases the chances that there's someone who's struggling with the emotional life, but it also really teaches us something about human psychology. And I think that's it's in a way like a very beautiful discovery process. There's other ways in which you can make sense of people's data, and this is going to become relevant a little bit later on when I talk about the so what part. And this is Facebook pages. So pages on Facebook that people can like. And again, we have like this personality trait of openness, where people are either open-minded, intellectually curious, interested in aesthetics, or more traditional, conservative on the other hand. And I should say all of them are normally distributed. So it's not that we just have these two buckets, but it's oftentimes helpful to think about the extremes. And what I like here, right, like open-minded, as you can imagine, science plays a big part in whether people are intellectually curious and excited to engage with ideas. I also like the fact that we have thunderstorms here and a little bit of fantasy and sci-fi. Now, one of the big questions is, how accurate can these predictions be, right? If I give a computer access to, in this case, all of the Facebook pages that you follow, how accurately can it predict something like your personality? And I can throw numbers at you, that the correlation between your self-reported personality and a computer-based prediction can go up to 0.5. Which first of all means it's certainly not perfect, but it also doesn't mean much, right? If I tell you it's a 0.5, is that good? Is that bad? So one of my colleagues back at Cambridge at the Psychometric Center had this like really nice idea of saying, could we just compare the accuracy of a computer predicting your personality to I complete a personality questionnaire. I tell you how extroverted I think I am. I tell you how open-minded I think I am, how agreeable I think I am. Then I give a computer access to all of my Facebook likes and ask it to make predictions. But I also ask my coworkers, so my colleagues, I ask friends, I ask family members, so my sister, my parents, whoever is part of the family, and then also my spouse, so my husband, to complete a questionnaire on my behalf. And now you can have this really nice race between computer-based predictions versus people in our environment. And what my colleague found, and this is like now over 10 years ago, with just the only data that she looked at was Facebook pages with like very simple models. But back then she already found that by accessing only 10 of your Facebook likes, the computer is better at predicting your personality than your colleagues, 65 likes better than people's friends, 120 likes to be better than family members. And again, those are people who know you pretty well. This includes siblings, parents, kids, and so on. And then 300 likes to be better than the spouse. Now, When she did the study, the average number of likes in the sample that she looked at was 230. So that back in the day, with only access to one data point, the computer already outperformed pretty much everybody in our environment except for the spouse. And again, you can imagine with better models, access to more data, the computer would probably outperform our closest confidants in a way that feels very intimate. Now, you can't give a talk on AI without mentioning generative AI like ChatGPT, right? And the reason for me this is so interesting is that generative AI in a way democratizes access to this type of psychological profiling that I've just been talking about. So back in the day when I started this research, it was a pretty substantial effort to create these models. So not just did you not only did you have to collect a data set that had both your psychological profile and the digital footprint that you were interested in. So let's say I want to predict your extroversion from what you post on Facebook. I had to collect this data set and now train a supervised model explicitly saying, I want you to take someone's Facebook likes, turn them into extroversion. Now, first of all, it was not always easy to get that data. And it was also limited to specifically that trait and specifically this data type of data input, right? The moment that I wanted to predict something else, say your values or your life satisfaction, my model was completely useless. The same is true for the data input. The moment that I didn't have access to your status updates, but I had credit card spending, that was the end of it. There was nothing that I could do with this model. What we know, and this is some research that I've recently done with some of my students in the lab, is you can simply use an off-the-shelf like ChatGPT and ask it, here's someone's social media posts, here's someone's credit card spending, here's someone's Google searches. Now you tell me, what do you think their big 5 personality profile is? Now you tell me, what do you think their levels of life satisfaction is? And it does a pretty remarkable job making these predictions. Again, it was never explicitly trained to do so, but because it's read the entire internet, it really kind of understands human psychology on a pretty fundamental level. Now you can take this a level further and kind of use chatbots, right? Chatbots in a way have the advantage that they can also ask specific questions. So if a chatbot figures out, well, I don't really know enough to make a good prediction of whether the person is neurotic or emotionally stable, well, I can just follow up with questions that try to give me that knowledge. So what we see is that once you start making this an interactive process with chatbots, you can bump up accuracy by quite a bit. Brings me to the second part. So once you have an understanding of people's psychology, what power does that give you over potentially influencing their behavior? And there's this, I'm sure that many of you have heard this phrase before, data is the new gold, data is the new oil. One of my friends in 2013 commented on this and saying like, big data is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it. Nobody really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing it. So everyone claims they are doing it, which I think was a very, very accurate description of what data science looked like back in the day, because companies were just amassing data without necessarily understanding how to use it. And the point, of course, is that it's not the data itself that is valuable, right? The same way that oil, for example, it's not the raw materials. You kind of have to refine it. And in the case of data, you essentially want these data-driven insights. And that's valuable oftentimes because once you've refined the data and you have an understanding of who is on the other side, that just gives you a lot of power over influencing their behavior through some kind of personalization, right? Once you understand what are the fears, the dreams, the aspirations, the preferences on the person on the other side, it actually kind of allows you to tap into those motivations. And in many ways, it mirrors like the way that we've interacted as humans for centuries, right? We always try to gauge who's on the other side and how do we make what I have to say relevant to them. Like kids learn this from a very early age, right? Kids know exactly how to ask their mom for candy to make sure they get it as opposed to their dad. The same is true for adults. You don't talk to a 3-year-old kid the same way that you talk to your boss, the same way that you talk to a friend. So it's so natural to us to go through this process of trying to understand what the other side wants to hear and needs and so on, and then adjusting what we offer and how we talk to who's on the other side, that we oftentimes don't realize this. And in a way, what data offers us is to replicate this at scale without the need for like an immediate face-to-face interaction. So I'm just going to give you one example, and then I'm going to broaden it a little bit out to other contexts and domains. But this was one of the studies that we did relatively early on. What was really trying to say, once I understand who's on the other side, I can change the way that they behave. So we kind of tried to, this was I should say, this was a campaign with a beauty retailer. So we worked with a beauty retailer in the UK, and their goal was to get people to click on an ad on Facebook, go to their online store and buy one of their beauty products. So they were agnostic as to what products the women bought. They just wanted to drive traffic to the website and have people buy something. Now, you can't really target personality explicitly on these platforms, right? So Facebook doesn't allow you to target extroverts or introverts or open-minded people or more conservative people, not because they don't know how to do it. Facebook filed a patent in 2015 for predicting personality from the internal data. So the fact that they were very surprised by Cambridge Analytica, is a little bit of a myth. But they don't allow advertisers to do that. However, what you can do, so this is a screenshot from the Facebook advertising platform from a couple of years ago now. You can target people based on the standard sociodemographics, right? Age, gender, languages, location, and so on. But you can also target them based on interests. And now, if you think back to some of the stuff that I've shown you earlier, we know that empirically certain interests are associated with certain personality traits. And what that allows me to do by mere association is to define an audience that on average is more extroverted than, let's say, a different audience, right? So if I know that these interests here are associated with extroversion, I can just say, give me people, show my ad to people who are connected to at least one of these likes, and therefore on average more extroverted. Super crude way of targeting, by the way. I'm sure like many misunderstood introverts in the extroverted condition and vice versa, but it's one way in which we can separate some of these personality audiences using existing tools. So what we did then with this beauty retailer is we asked their creative team and told them like, look, we want you to come up with different ads. Some of them should be tailored to extroversion, so people outgoing and social. And you can see the image was always, there was something going on. It was many people. It was like on a dance floor. It was like saturated colors. The text said something like, dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. So playing with the need of extroverts to be the center of attention. And then the introverted ones, in contrast, would always like one woman, like in front of in a much more quiet setting. So the text here said something like, beauty doesn't have to shout. And what we found back in the day with this like very, very crude way of targeting, and also very, very crude way of personalization, because the only thing that we adjusted was actually the ad that people saw on Facebook. Once they went to the platform and the website, it looked exactly the same for everybody. Was already a 50% increase in the number of purchases that these women made when they were presented with these ads that matched their personalities, opposed to the ones that didn't match. So like again, it means that once I understand who's on the other side, that gives me quite a bit of power over influencing your behavior. Now you can imagine, same thing with generative AI, which can do part of that psychological profiling. It can also very easily do some of that content creation piece, right? Because again, it understands psychology, so it can tailor content to different types of psychological profiles. So here, this is just like a very simple example where I asked ChatGPT, write me a short ad for an iPhone that speaks to a person who scores high on the personality traits of openness and extroversion. You don't need to explain what they are because it knows the principles and the concept. It comes up with something really, really nice here, like unleash your creativity, connect like never before, express yourself, explore more, stay ahead. So it really kind of captures this essence of extroversion. You can take it a level further and say, well, write me a prompt for DALL-E or Sora and generate an image that goes with this ad. It does a pretty remarkable job. Again, it comes up with, here's what I would write. It's an energetic, vibrant scene of young people, kind of in a stylish setting, saturated colors. And if you then pop that into DALL-E, you can see that what comes out is actually pretty decent. It made me a little bit happy that the faces are still scrambled when you give it those instructions. So I think there's a human edge that we still have. AI is certainly not perfect, but I do think we're getting there really quickly where you can automate this entire process, right? I can give an off-the-shelf transformer model access to your data. They can translate it into something that makes sense and then also generate content in a way that speaks directly to these motivations. Now, one of the big questions that I give a lot of space in the book to is like, should we be terrified or elated? As any good scientific answer, I think we should be both, right? So I think that the downsides are very obvious. And for me, it's not just this question of privacy. It's not just that someone can kind of snoop around in our private lives. For me, it's as much a question of agency and self-determination. So once someone understands what we want, what we fear, what we desire, and they can push us in a certain direction in terms of how we feel, how we think about the world, and how we show up and behave in the world, that means that suddenly the choices that we make are no longer our own, right? And you can argue that it's always been the case, right? We were always influenced by the people around us, by the situation that we're in. But we're kind of entering this world where it's very unidirectional. So there's like some entities trying to capture our attention, trying to influence our behavior. And more often than not, we not only don't understand that this is happening, but we also don't have control over whether we allow that influence to happen or not. So I think there's a lot to be said about the dark side. Now, for me, one of the really important points in the book and in a lot of the research that I've been doing for the last couple of years is highlighting that there's also this bright side to it, right? If you go back to this notion of the village, I said initially that, yeah, there was like a lot of manipulation, but there was also something incredibly helpful going on by people understanding me. So some of the research that I've been doing over the last few years is trying to show this other side. So if I can get, for example, if I can use psychological targeting to get you to spend more, as in the case of the beauty retailer, could we also use it to help people with a task that most of us struggle with, which is saving, right? So in the US, the picture when you look at and people saving looks incredibly grim. 50% of people live paycheck to paycheck. 10% of people couldn't even go a week without getting paid. And that's a really dire situation to be in, because it means that all that needs to happen to you is something unexpected. Your car breaks down, you don't have the money to bring it to the shop, you now can't get to work, you lose the job, and so on. So kind of this idea that we should help people create at least some level of savings, like a buffer, is incredibly important. We also know that it's incredibly hard, right? Anyone who studies the mind knows that that's not what the brain is good at, because you have to give up like an immediate reward in the here and now for something that potentially helps you in the future when you need those savings. So what we did here is we teamed up with a fintech company called SaverLife. They try to help low income households save more. So in our case, we work with a sample of people with less than $100 in their savings account. So again, this is like critical. Something needs to happen, and it's game over. And what we try to do is, the Save a Life it's called a race to 100. So they try to encourage all of their users to save an additional $100 over the course of 4 weeks. And if they manage, they get entered into lottery, and they have an opportunity to win a cash prize. But they've been working on the messaging for a long time, as you can imagine, trying to see how do we get the most people to sign up and then also hit their saving goals. So this is what we use as the baseline. So just using their standard messaging. And then in one of our conditions, we essentially surveyed people to get a sense of their personality, and then we created messages playing into these different needs. So if you have someone, for example, who scores high on agreeableness, so again, those people who care about their social relationships, you're not going to convince them by saying, put some money to the side right now to get ahead of the game and be better than everybody else in your environment. What you can do, and what really gets them to think about savings differently, is say, well, you put some money to the side right now to make sure that you and your loved ones are protected in the here and now and in the future, right? So it's kind of using savings to make sure that you kind of protect the people that you love. And again, similar to the beauty retailer example, we actually saw that tapping into people's personality, but in creating these messages, we were able to increase the number of people who actually hit the $100 saving goal by about 60% compared to the baseline messaging that they've been working on for a couple of years. Again, it's certainly nowhere near perfect, right? We didn't get everybody to save the $100, far from it, but it was like a pretty substantial uptake in the number of people who managed. There's so many other contexts where you can use it, like helping people find careers that are meaningful, but not just based on your resume, not just based on everything that you've done before. Education, right? You can imagine that you can use this type of stuff not only to identify people who might be having a hard time and struggling, but you can then also make education so much more enjoyable and so much more fun by figuring out what is actually exciting for the person on the other side. So I have a 1-year-old son, and I'm excited for him to kind of go through some of this learning in a way that kind of is a lot more tailored to his needs, and hopefully a lot more engaging than when I was going through high school. And mental health is another context that I personally care a lot about, both in terms of tracking, right? So one of the problems that we have with mental health is that oftentimes diagnosis comes way too late. It's tough to find your way out of the valley of a depression once you're there. It's much better to say, can we catch you early, either by tapping into something like your smartphone sensors, right? If I see that you're not leaving the house as much anymore as you typically do, you're not engaging in social conversations, like either taking calls, sending messages as much anymore. Maybe you kind of oftentimes pick up the phone at night. So there's all of these indicators that maybe it's nothing, right? Maybe you're just on vacation, having a great time, but there's these deviations from your baseline, and we could send you these all early warning triggers to say, why don't you look into this? And if you know that you have a history of struggling from depression, why don't you also nominate someone who we could alert in a case, who then can reach out and make sure that you're okay? Same is true for treatment. There's like lots of opportunities to use AI to not only kind of detect whether you might be struggling early on, but then also based on everything that we know about you, give you the best type of treatment and almost act like this continuous coach to help you get better. So lots of opportunities in that space as well, which really for me makes this last question so important of what now? Like if we believe that there's true opportunities that this kind of psychological profiling, understanding people's needs and preferences offers, but there's also this very dark side of how do we make sure that this doesn't get abused in terms of manipulating us, in terms of taking away our agency and self-determination, then the question of like, how do we actually manage this space effectively? And oftentimes what you see, and I fully agree that regulation is part of this entire picture, right? So regulation in a way is trying to protect you from the most egregious abuses. And oftentimes what you see in the European Union, in California, for example, with the CCPA, the basic principles are transparency and control. So the idea is I just need to tell you what's happening with your data, and I need to give you control to manage it properly, and you'll be able to essentially become a steward of your own data. I 100% agree that that's absolutely necessary, right? Like if we generate the data and our choices are being influenced, we should have control. So I'm certainly not against these types of control. But what I would argue is that it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough. And I've been thinking about this in this analogy of it feels like this, what the regulation is trying to do is put you in charge of your own boat, right? If you kind of think about the captain of your own sailing boat, and by the way, this is also generated by DALL-E, and it messed up entirely the steering wheel and the foot. So I'm keeping it just to make myself feel better as a human. But being a captain of your own, like being put in charge of your own boat is fun and great if you're drifting along the Mediterranean Sea where the weather is nice and you can only make good choices, right? Any town that you pick is going to be a very nice destination. I don't think that that's the environment that we're in. My argument is that the environment that we're in looks much more like this here. It's like a raging thunderstorm. There's a gazillion emergencies at the same time. It's very hard to understand what's going on. And in this case, right, and if that's the environment that we're in, where we don't understand how technology is being used, we don't have the time to manage our data 24/7, and then being put in charge of your own boat and being just given the control to manage it properly, I think is much more of a responsibility and a burden than it really is a right. So I've been thinking a lot about how do we complement these approaches to regulation in terms of transparency and control with something that, in a way, I think of it as like it tames the sea, makes it easier for people to navigate, right? And that could be as simple as defaults. If the default is not you're being opted in to have all of your data being taken and scraped and sold on, but you actually actively have to say that you want a company to use your data because you understand and you can see the value that they create, that would be like totally different. So it makes it easy for people to do the right thing. But the one that I briefly want to mention before we head into the Q&A which I think is like this very promising concept that not that many people are talking about right now, is what I think of as giving people a competent crew. So giving people a support network to actually benefit from their data, right? If you think about regulation, typically what it does, it tries to minimize the risk for the collective, so to prevent the most egregious abuses, but it doesn't help each of us to make the most of our data. So what I mean by competent crew is actually bringing me back to this village that I grew up in. Because what happened there is, so when I grew up, my parents still owned some of the vineyards. And most families in the regions actually do. And they're typically really small. So they're so small that you harvest your own grapes, but you certainly don't have enough grapes to produce your own wine. And you also certainly don't have the expertise and time to do that. So what happens in this region is people come together in wine co-ops. So that's essentially families coming together under an entity that pools the grapes and then hires experts to either sell them off to the bigger wineries for a better price, because now you have a lot of grapes, or hires experts to actually make the wine themselves instead of selling it. So the idea is that people have a shared interest and a shared sort of resource coming together to exploit it when it comes to the value that it generates. The same is true for data. So if you think about this data as like this resource that, first of all, your data is not really valuable if it's just your data. If you think about using data to better understand a disease, for example, that is rare, if you just look at your own genetics and your own medical history, you're not going to learn much, right? What you need is people pooling their data so you can see patterns and you can see, okay, this is something that leads to these types of symptoms. Here's a medication that works for this type of patient. So oftentimes we benefit only if we pool our data. And what data co-ops do, and the health space is actually an interesting one, because we have actual data co-ops like My Data in Switzerland, which looks at predominantly at patients suffering from MS. So one of these diseases where it's incredibly poorly understood because it's determined by so many factors, again, genetics, lifestyle, medical history, nutrition, that you really benefit from having a lot of data. And what they do is they come together as a member-owned co-op. So the entity is owned by the members, which means that the co-op is legally obligated to act in their best interest, and members have a say of like what are their preferences? Do they want to donate their data for research purposes? Do they want their insights be passed on to their physicians directly? So one of the big benefits of this type of data structure is that actually the data co-op not only learns something about MS in general, right? Here's like how the disease develops, here's the treatments that work, but they also provide direct information to the patient's physicians in the hospital saying, here's something that we've seen work for other patients. Why don't you try this with your patient who seems to be going through a similar trajectory in terms of the symptoms? And then there's a feedback loop where the physician can give feedback to the data co-op and improve further. But it's a totally different model, right? Because it's not a central entity owning all of your data. And in the health space context, it's usually pharma companies that kind of capture that data. Maybe they develop a drug. In the best case, you get to pay millions for that drug in a couple of years. Worst case, you never benefit from it. So data co-ops really flip it on its head and say, how do we empower users or individuals by coming together, learning something about their data, potentially commercializing the data in a way that creates a lot more value, but really maximizing the utility they can get from their data instead of just mitigating risks with regulation. So those are just some ideas from the book, and I'm super excited to dive into the conversation. I actually thought that, by the way, the book right now is, I think, about 30% off on Amazon. So if you don't have a copy and you want one, this week might be a good one to do that. But very excited to take some of the questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. And we actually had a question right away from Sam regarding one of your first slides around the word clouds.
Yeah.
If there's any meaning assigned to the colors, so the pink versus purple, or was it just the size?
Yeah, so great question. So let me see this, like size and color. Now I'm not entirely sure which one is which, but one is just prevalence. So how often do these words appear, generally speaking, in people's status updates? And the other one is the association. So the other one is the correlation. My intuition is that the size of the word is actually the strength of the correlation. So the bigger the word, the more predictive it is of extroversion. And then the color, I think, is the prevalence. But I would have to look that up. It's one way or the other.
But that's already super helpful. Thank you so much. And then Sharon was wondering what the campaign was called to save money for introverts. If you could touch upon that a little bit more.
Yeah. So generally speaking, the collaboration was with Saver Life. So they're like a fintech company on the West Coast, and it's a really nice one because they're really trying to almost guide them through this experience of like, how do you save more? They try to incentivize them, but then also gradually fade out the incentives so that there's like this more intrinsic motivation for people to save. And we looked at all of the big five traits. So I just mentioned in my example the one for agreeableness, which was actually based on some of my earlier work. Because in my earlier work, I had found that people who are agreeable, so these nice guys who are caring and trusting, they on average have lower levels of saving, higher levels of debt, and higher levels of default. And what we found is that people just said like, well, I don't care about money as much, which my hope was that it would be something related to they're not as kind of successful negotiating, because you can very easily train that. And I was like, kind of when I saw the findings, like, oh, that's a bummer, right? I don't want these people to become greedy. I don't want them to suddenly say, yeah, I care a lot about money. Because we have like always this idea that if you care about money, you don't care about your social relationships and vice versa, which obviously in a way doesn't make sense, right? For that agreeable person, it's true that if they want to protect their loved ones, especially with those people who have like such low levels of savings, you better manage your money, because if you don't manage your money properly, you're also going to impact the people who depend on you. So that was the motivation, and that's the agreeableness that we started with. But then you can imagine for introverts and extroverts, which in our case was coincided with a pandemic. So we capitalized on the fact that we just told people, look, if you put some money to the side right now, just imagine what you can do when the world opens up again. You can take your friends out for drinks and go out and have like a fun social life again. So that was for extroverts. And then for introverts, we just played into this. If you put some money to the side right now, just imagine how much more cozy and how much more comfortable you can make your home by utilizing some of that money in the future. So I think it really kind of plays into, what do you understand about the psychological traits and how could you respond? And humans are incredible at that, right? All of the market teams that I've worked with, just by giving them a sense of here's the personality trait, they come up with a incredible content. And now the same is also true for generative AI.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And really powerful interventions that can be designed here. James was wondering how detailed idiosyncratic can psychological profiling get, and what are the barriers, challenges, apart from data privacy concerns?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I think you're absolutely right in that oftentimes getting the full picture of the person is extremely helpful, right? So if you think about what are the limitations of the stuff that you post on social media, well, it's to some extent self-idealized, right? To some extent, we all are a little bit happier, all healthier, all more extroverted, less neurotic. So it's like it gives you a sliver of still, like most psychologists, I think, would agree that the person you want to be is actually part of who you are, right? And as a marketer, you can imagine understanding that someone wants to be more extroverted than they actually are is just as helpful as understanding that they're extroverted. But you can also imagine that you can at some point triangulate and say, well, maybe we're all pretending to be a little bit more organized than we really are on social media, or like in some of our LinkedIn profiles, everything that's curated. But then the moment that you get access to, let's say, your phone data, one of the things that we know is that if your phone is constantly running low on battery or out of battery, you're not the most organized, conscientious person, which happens to me all the time. My husband keeps complaining because it's just all the time. Or if I see you kind of shopping at the deli 3 times a day because you can't plan ahead for the next meal. There's like all of these traces that you have a much harder time kind of faking, right? Because you really have to change your entire life. And that's from a psychological point of view. If you think about accuracy, if you think about the breadth of understanding that we can generate, that's already super helpful. Now, oftentimes what the early stage research, which is oftentimes just it's because you want to understand human behavior more broadly and generally, focuses on these general models, right? I just say like across the board, if you kind of use these swear words, you're less agreeable than the average person. But in some contexts, especially when you think of like mental health, for example, it's much more promising to train models for each and every single person, right? What you want to know is, well, here's some general indicators of, yeah, you're not leaving the house as much anymore or this and that. But what you really want is to say, for you specifically, not just how much do you deviate from your baseline, but what are your triggers? So one of the things that we know, and there's now papers that look at this like more idiosyncratic approach to personality and behavior prediction. If I can get your behavioral history mapped onto some of the outcomes that I'm interested in, the models that I can build are much better. But you're obviously also right in that it becomes even more intrusive when we think about it in terms of privacy, if we capture the full piece and we really zoom in onto your decision making.
Amazing, thank you. We have another question by an anonymous attendee. They are first of all thanking you for the amazing talk. And then if we want to train our own personality models, which data sources can we look today to predict personality, given Facebook and Twitter now have stringent policy on data scraping?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, first of all, there's still ways you can scrape, right? So anything I think that you could manually click through, there's a way of scraping the data. And for me, the part that I oftentimes tell my students or collaborators who want to use some of those predictions in their research is that you don't actually need your own model anymore. Right, because what you can do is you can just simply go through like some of the ChatGPT. Now, depends a little bit on whether you're doing this in the context of like a small lab study, because there it's oftentimes easy to, first of all, you have to go through IRB in the sense that everybody has to consent and you have a chance to have people download their data. Sometimes it helps if you, like, let's say you're just using ChatGPT to make the predictions and all you need is access to the data. It's sometimes helpful to just collaborate with existing companies. And my experience in that space is that startups are oftentimes an easier target. So when I started working in that space and I wanted to get data for like mental health, for example, was one of the ones where I kind of wanted to work with a company who has self-reported like emotional kind of responses, like a diagnostic tool, like a real diagnostic tool for depression attached to something like GPS. I approached startups who are working in that space and was like, well, is there any way that we can collaborate? Because you have the user base, you have the data, and I can give you the expertise, and I can give, if you want either insights, if you want to be anonymous in my publication, or I can give you exposure, right, and mention you in that publication. So you get like this academic credibility, and that's oftentimes a way in which you can get data, and then you just need to produce the insights, and either that's you training your own model or that's you leveraging some of the models that are already out there.
Thank you. We have another question from James. Do you have opinions on what advantages in data insight capability might or should trigger getting opt-in consent?
Okay, should trigger. I have a lot of opinions, so there's no skill. That's the benefit of writing a book, as opposed to academic papers. You know, in academic papers, you need a citation for everything. In a book, you're just like, I think, and here's my opinion. So I recommend. It doesn't have to be a book, but if you want to write a blog post or like an op-ed or something, it's well worth it. So generally speaking, I do think that you do see. I think this going in the direction of opt-in. Some of it is just removal of data sources, right? Like Apple in a way was driving this, like we get rid of the third-party cookies, which made it a lot harder for advertisers in many spaces. And the shift that I think that you saw was that they kind of went a lot more to first-party tracking and other data sources. I think the European Union is trying to focus a lot more opt-in. The problem that you get, and this is also like why I think you need something like opt-in, because it's just like, but it's really tricky in the sense that like once you see it everywhere, people become so mindless, right? It's like in Europe, it's like the cookie tracking. In the beginning, people like you kind of every single website you get asked which do you accept the cookies not, and it doesn't really make it easy for you. So if you really want to say I want only the essentials, you have to most of the time go in, click through all of the things, then you have your selection, and then still the button that blinks bright red in the bottom is the one accept all, and the tiny one barely noticeable says yeah, pick my selection. So company, it's like you kind of adapt to like the seeing it everywhere, and you get so annoyed. And most people don't have the time, right, to think about this 24/7 and every single time manage it properly. So I feel like if we move to opt-in, ideally we combine it with something where people can either set like really broad preferences that help them, right? If I had a digital twin that first of all learns what I do, and maybe even take some preferences that I have and say, okay, in these instances I might be willing to kind of consent, or in these instances I might not, or even products that say, yeah, like we're gonna grant initial access, and then in a week's time we're going to see if you actually like the product enough to kind of keep it or not, and otherwise we're going to just pull you out. So I feel like this shift to opt-in, and it needs to happen in a way that we don't just adjust to it and we kind of become so deaf to seeing it everywhere that we're not really utilizing it anymore. So I think we do see this shift a little bit, but my hope is that it's going to be complemented by some other technologies that's either like these digital twins that can help us navigate. Sometimes that's technologies that make the collection of data redundant in the first place. So federated learning oftentimes means that like anything can be trained on your phone, right? If you're Siri, you don't have to grab all of your speech data, send it to a central server where you can process it. What Apple can do is they just send the intelligence to your phone, and now suddenly you kind of, it eliminates this trade-off, right? You can say, yeah, no, I want you to process my data and improve my speech recognition, but I don't want you to grab the data in the first place. So it's a totally different model where it almost goes above and beyond just the opt-in.
The next question by Sharon actually builds a little bit on that. Would you say data privacy is non-existent because of this form of data analytics?
I mean, I don't think, I think it's a great question. I don't think this form of data analytics changes anything in terms of how exposed we are. So in my opinion, I think why was Cambridge Analytica such a big deal? I think it's just because it makes it understandable, right? So political campaigns had always been using like data for a long time. Most of them were actually celebrated for like the smart use of data. And on some level, if you don't have a human in the loop, like I don't need personality in the middle, but a computer can take all of your data and just make the same predictions. You kind of get exposed just by merely generating the data because there's now an entity that's artificial and can make sense of that altogether. The reason why I think the psychological part is interesting in the middle is that it makes it a lot more intimate for us, right? I think the moment that you tell someone, I can take your GPS records and translate it into a diagnosis of whether you're suffering from depression, or I can take your social media and predict whether you're impulsive and neurotic. Suddenly that feels a lot more personal and intrusive than maybe just having your data out there. So I don't think this new type of profiling makes any difference because the data is already out there. But there's, and this is, I also write about this in the book. I think there's this general sentiment, which I think is dangerous, that people say, well, there's just no way of getting our privacy back. Let's just kind of, let's forget about it and move on. And usually that's paired with, but I have nothing to hide, so why would I be worried about this? And I understand the sentiment because I think I've been there, right? It's like such a full-time job and you're like, I just can't do it. Let's just give up. And I don't feel particularly concerned. But it's a very privileged position to be in. Like if you're not worried about your data being out there, that just means that you're currently in a really, really good spot because it's not true for everybody, right? If I can predict sexual orientation based on your data, that still in many parts of the world is something that you probably don't want to have out there publicly available. In the US, Roe versus Wade, I think was one of these examples where suddenly overnight, a lot of women woke up to the reality that the data is so much more intimate, right? Whether that's your Google searches, whether that's your GPS records, which might tell someone else the clinics that you go to, that you travel across state, and maybe your searches change after. So I think this idea that you don't have to worry about your data because you have nothing to hide, and therefore we should just easily give up on it, is very privileged. And it might be totally different tomorrow, right? Because the data that you generate in a way is permanent, and the leadership that's using it isn't. And I mean, it's sad how relevant this has become. Because in the book, I talk about how there's like historical precedents in Nazi Germany where then like religious affiliation being part of the census made a huge difference across European countries in terms of atrocities, right? You can imagine if that's part of the census, all you have to do is go to City Hall, find where the people live. Now, same is true in a way with data today, because it gives you very similar insights. So if there's someone who wants to discriminate against a certain group tomorrow, you don't need the sensors. It's all out there in data. And I think the fact that people are very concerned about Elon Musk and his team accessing all of the personal information of federal employees is one of these examples, because you just don't know what's going to happen with the data once it's out there.
Thank you.
On a somewhat not so positive note.
Yeah, maybe Alexandra's question can actually end us on a positive note. So she's asking, your research has been applied in marketing, health interventions, and even politics. What industry do you think has the most potential for using psychological targeting for positive impact?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be health and education. And it's both, because the baseline in both is just really bad. So in healthcare is we typically only see people when they're sick. So we don't have a good way of tracking. We also don't have a good understanding of how should we treat certain patients with a certain demographic background and so on, because we don't have the data. So healthcare, I think, is one of these contexts where we could do so much better. Same is true for education. If you look at how do kids get educated, it's been the same for years and years, decades, centuries. And I think that's really what's going to revolutionize in a way that makes it personalized for more than just the elite kids, right? If you're in a very good school, maybe you get that treatment. If you're not in an elite school, you don't get it. And my hope is that it's going to democratize access to education that is personal, enjoyable, and then also effective.
Thank you so much. And we're actually at the hour. So thank you so much. This was amazing. And I think we are all looking forward to reading your book and learning more about psychological targeting and how this field actually develops. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. If you're ever in New York, come say hi. I'll sign it.